Добрый день, уважаемые коллеги. Мы рады вас приветствовать в Российском совете по международным делам. Наша встреча сегодня на английском будет проходить, поэтому я перехожу на этот язык. So, it's a pleasure for us to welcome Mr. Oливер Гнад here in Moscow. I will say a couple of words about the idea of this meeting, how it emerged, and briefly characterize the trajectory which made this meeting possible. Last year we conducted two important exercises independently from each other. The first one was conducted by the Center for Strategic Research, and we have Anton Svetov from CSR here, which is headed by Minister Alexei Kudrin, who for a long time occupied the position of the Minister of Finance and now leads Center for Strategic Research, and they prepared a report for a president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, with the project of reforms. And we were part of this work, of this important work, responsible for foreign policy part of this report, and we designed a text which is called Thesis for Foreign Policy of Russia 2017-2024. So keeping in mind the new political cycle in Russia. That was, surprisingly, the text was having a high resonance here. In Russia, we were severely criticized from all the flanks, so caused fire on ourselves by liberals, by conservatives, by communists, by, well, everyone who were not lazy enough to criticize us, criticized us. And I think that that was one of the achievements of our work. And at the same time, also last year, we conducted independently, completely independently, without knowing our plans. We conducted a scenario brainstorming and prepared it in a very original form of the newspaper. Newspaper from can I show it? Newspaper. It's from Saturday, October 21, 2025. So nearly the same date, nearly the same deadline as we had in our postulates of Russian foreign policy. So, and it was a pleasure for me to be a part of this exercise, and Oliver was an intellectual leader and organizer and moderator of the whole stuff. So it is his baby in a sense. And consequently we let's say came up with the idea to have a as we call pilot meeting here in Moscow to discuss both products. We got a feedback on our text from Oliver, and it's great that this postulates the thesis of foreign policy I read abroad, and we see our meeting today as an opportunity to discuss the future of Russia, how it is perceived in Germany and beyond, in European Union, the future of the global futures, and let's say make a brief discussion on how we assess what we desire, what we are not desire, what we desire, what we are not, and let's say think about our joint work for the future. I must say that we have another important background for this meeting. Can I also show it? 1 year ago we published this piece, A World in 100 Years. So that was another exercise in future imagination. So it turned out that we tried ourselves in different genres, in different kinds of forecasting and thinking about the future. on strategic long-term forecast for 100 years, tactical forecast for 1 year. This year we published our 1-year forecast, and midterm forecast for 5-6 years. What we did with the Center for Strategic Research. So it's a pleasure to have all of you here, and I propose the following format of our meeting. I will now pass the floor to Oliver for his introductory speech, and then we will have Q&A session. I'm calling you for being flexible, for being free, being informal. So we have a meeting of friends here, of people who are, let's say, interested, who are intellectually free, and in a sense, who strive to, let's say, to think out of the box on the issues we are dealing with. And Natasha Evtikhevich, our director for Euro-Atlantic programs, will lead the meeting and Q&A session. So, if you are okay with with this plan, I'm passing the floor to Oliver, please.
Thank you, Ivan, for the kind introduction and for having me here at the RIAC. My name is Oливер Гнад. I'm from Berlin, as Ivan just said. The co-founder of the Büro für Zeitgeschehen, which basically means it's the Bureau of Current Affairs. We're just a young and very small organization, and we're engaged in strategic foresight for the Foreign Office in Berlin. As you probably know, the Foreign Office started a foresight unit 2 years ago after meddling with crisis the last decade, and they assumed, saying we cannot only brush up crisis, we need to be much more anticipatory in our policy approach, so we need to think ahead. So this is what we do with them, having strategic discussions moderated through foresight techniques. So the Foreign Office did a whole lot of foresight on the MENA region, basically all states and countries in that region during the last 1.5 years. They're doing foresight on the West Balkans. As you know, they are on a way to tipping to either side, or probably even out of Europe completely. And as you all know, we are stuck in the European Union with our deepening, widening, and any kind of coherence. So this is what we do with them. And we are engaged in the education of diplomats to foresight analysis. So just briefly, I assume that everybody knows about your, as I perceive it, a fantastic, a very deep and dense report on the trajectories of Russian foreign policy up until the year 2024. I read it with pleasure 3 times, because whenever you read it, you discover more details. It is a report from a German angle, which really walks a very thin line, as we all know who are in that business. And this is why it is so valuable, because it is not an ideological piece, it is not something for explaining from an interest perspective, but trying to resolve the questions we are all in the midst of, and no matter where you come from. And one more remark before I start on the content is, I think this is why strategic foresight as a methodology is so important. It reframes the world we're living in, and it gives you a different perspective on the crisis you're in the midst of. So try to step 2 steps back, reframe the situation, try to put yourself in the other's shoes, and you will perceive the world differently, and it will open up a path to solve common threats, common interests, and differences. And if you don't sort them out, you will find ways to bypass them and probably address them later on. So, as I assume that you all know the RIAC report, let me give a few remarks. First on what is the wider environment, Russian and European policies taking place right now? What is the global framework we have to address? And then I would like to address the 5 recommendations Ivan, Andrei, and Sergei referred to in the report. I come to this in a minute. As Ivan just hinted, 2024 is a meaningful policy cycle because it's the end of a policy cycle not only in Russia, but also in the United States. As you know, the 4-year time frame of the president either gives us a second term for Donald Trump, or it will be the end of the first term of a successor, a new incumbent in the White House, which either closes the trend we are looking at right now, which leads us into a transatlantic rift, or the pendulum swings back and probably gives us a new transatlantic relationship and a new relationship in the Eurasian context. The other thing is that 2024 is in the midst of the new policy cycle or budgetary cycle in the European Union. As you all know, 2020 will be the new budgetary cycle of the European Union. It's a 7-year cycle. And given what we are discussing in Europe right now on common defense and security policy, you will see the ambition of West European states to really be part of the ball game in security policy, apart from the Americans with their own defense structure, probably with a common industry. It all now depends, as you know, on whether the German politics gets its act together. We're just ahead of within the next 2 weeks we know whether we have a new grand coalition, and then, as you're all aware, is whether the French-German engine will move forward. My take on this is this will be a very narrow margin in Germany for the grand coalition. We're going to have it, and I'm pretty sure that Macron is pushing hard for a new leadership, not only within the European Union, but also being part of this hardballs game in Europe, which would be different than the Americans would play it. It would be much more an integrated hardball, softball game than we know it from US and Russian experience. Another trajectory is the year for the year 2024 is that President Xi's tenure will last up until 2022. And the Chinese president already said last year that China is heading towards world power leadership up until 2049, the centennial of China's coming into being as an independent world actor. So this is a change, and not only in rhetoric, you can see that already playing out, not only in Central Asia, but in the southern China Sea. And when it comes probably to Korea, we will see that in the course of the next months. So this is probably the framework we look at when it comes to time frames. When it comes to regions, you were well aware of the fact that the Middle East is not anymore in void, in a vacuum, but it's heavily restructured. Sykes-Picot is over, and the question is who is leading the restructuring of order, security, and prosperity in the region. My take would be it is not a ball game among Iran and Saudi Arabia. It will rather be a ball game between Iran, Turkey, Russia, and Israel. So this would be my caveat to the current discussion. And another thing which is probably not too much into our daily picture is the change of the habitat, the ecological and geographic environment up until 2024. Most pronounced is climate change. Nobody really thinks in climate change of security issues. By 2024, the Arctic will be ice-free during the whole of the summer, at least for months, which for the first time in human history, geography, which was a given in geopolitics, changed dramatically. It is a disruptive change of the security environment, not only for Russia, but also for the United States and Canada, and also for Europe. And if you know that China right now builds 4 icebreakers, it is not for shipping in the South Chinese Sea. So this gives you an idea what this dramatic change in climate change might lead to in the years to come. And this is just next door. It is the next big thing coming. And nobody really is addressing it. Last but not least, technological change. It's a no-brainer for everybody, but it needs to be mentioned. We all talk about digitalization as we use cell phones, but the advancement of artificial intelligence in weaponry and warfare is dramatically shifting during the last 2 to 3 years. You probably have seen the special issue of The Economist on the next war. If you read those articles, it gives you a notion where we're heading to. Just one thing to mention is semi-autonomous systems of drones which take their own decisions on how to control missions, how to attack and target without anybody in the theater of war, but basically not only sitting at the joystick, but having those systems driving autonomically without any guidance, because the logic is that these systems learn for themselves. Okay, this for the starter. One last thing, energy revolution. This is probably the last thing I should address, especially for those countries who rely on heavy hydrocarbon exports, and Russia is one of them. By the mid of the next decade, one of the big societal difficulties or societal conflicts will be who is going to burn how much fossil fuel, because climate change is going to disrupt our infrastructures. And this might be one of the most important changes, as climate change is for the geopolitical issue when it comes to energy revolution. We will witness massive destruction of infrastructures through climate change impact. It's been estimated that 80% of the infrastructure that has been built in the 20th century might be destroyed during the course of the next 15 to 20 years. Knowingly that as much people, 80%, live near coast, which is defined by 100 miles land inwards, 80% of the population, the world's population. And if you see the heavy weather impact and the sea level rise, you can imagine what that means. That for the starter. And the second part, I just want to address the recommendations of your report, Ivan, on Russian foreign policy up until 2024. And you, in your summary, your executive summary, you dwelled on 5 important topics, and I go by them piece by piece as you allow. I think the most important, and it's the introductory part of your report, is the framing of it. And you say, and I cite that, the key sentence of the whole piece seems to me that the underdevelopment of the Russian economy and its government institutions poses a much more significant threat to the country's sovereignty and territorial integrity than realistic military threats. And that it is impossible to overcome this underdevelopment in isolation from the international community. And if everybody agrees on that bottom line, you have you as the international system, not as Russia, you have a very big problem, because an actor which a country is spreading half the world with at least 8 geostrategic regions which are basically ungoverned, from the Arctic to the Baltic, which is highly governed, to the North Pacific, to the Mediterranean, you name them all. You need to have an integrated Russia. It is indispensable. If we start from that bottom line, everybody else falls into a different place than we currently debate it. So the key question is, and you pose it like that, what would be an optimal formula that Russia and the world can benefit from globalization, and to have leeway and broad room for foreign policy initiatives, which basically means to take care of your own security or have arrangements for collective security. So the first recommendation Ivan and the team addresses is that Russia needs to create an appealing economic zone of integration and a collective security institutional landscape within the post-Soviet space. I address caveats from an analytical point of view. It should not be perceived as an ideological point of view, a Western point of view, but a purely analytical point of view. There might be shades of perspective from the West, sorry for that, but this is how we perceive our worlds and our interests, and I'm happy to discuss this later on. So from an economic point of view, a strong economic base is a prerequisite to play an important role in a globalized economy. But currently, Russia's rentier economy, which is basically based on fossil fuels and weapon exports, is not up to the job. Russia needs a much wider, and this is not new, economic diversification to be attractive for investors, to play a game in this Industry 4.0 world, artificial intelligence and integrated systems. And this is due to a rent-seeking elite in Russia, which is basically centered around Putin and his cronies, and a very weak institutional landscape to steer innovation, creativity, and link up to the globalized economic and security foreign policy world. So one solution would be to enlarge the cake. Enlarging the cake would mean what is the environment Russia can dwell upon beyond the post-Soviet space, and beyond the thinking that there is a special right for Russia to have a cordon sanitaire in the post-Soviet space. As long as Russia plays a zero-sum game, this will never be ended. Because once you perceive a win or a loss for you or your opponent, you will never get to a higher level of cooperation in games. And this is, I think, the lesson we in Germany learned after the Second World War is the only way to survive in a tiny spot in Middle Europe is to cooperate and merge interests and sort out threats without coming to grips short term. If you have threats you have to address, you need to iron them out mid-term, long-term, because the transfer costs of conflict are much too high to bear it, and you will not end up in a better space if you sort them out in a zero-sum game thinking. So the question would be, what is the economic vision that competes with the rest of the world Russia has? I'll leave it like that. What is the next big idea? And I can hint on its potential when it comes to resources. Russia is the only country in the world which has all elements of the chemically periodic system in its country. It is self-sufficient. More than that, it has all the resources and the land to invest in an energy revolution. It has all the knowledge and the academic capacity to play a leading role in the digital economy. It has all the cultural power and connectivity to all regions in the world and all religions in the world. So this is a capital that many other countries have. So you have enough resources to reach out for cooperation if you end the zero-sum game thinking. When it comes to security, institution and landscape, we all know that Russia right now lacks one of the prerequisites, the basic currencies, which is trust. Russian politicians, and if you hear Lavrov at the Munich Security Conference every once in a while, every year, it's the same issue for Russia. Trust vis-à-vis the West, so this is a commonality we have. But I don't address trust between the West and Russia. I address trust between Russia and the post-Soviet space. And you can look upon the military meddling in Georgia from an international law perspective. It was the right and the mandate for Russian forces to intervene there, and it was not really smart from the Georgian president to drive such a big wedge into Ossetia. But the response was asymmetrically strong, and troops are still there in Georgia, Russian troops are still there in Georgia. So it's a trust issue here, but as you all know, Ukraine and the Crimean issue is a much harder question to answer. I don't go into more depth because it's so obvious. It's the first time that a country changes the European landscape by the use of force and annexation, even if it's a proto-constitutional act to integrate it into the Russian Federation. So trust is the issue here, and it has erased much of the soft power potential of Russia in its immediate neighborhood. So the question here is how to rebuild trust, and my suggestion would be, and I did this in the introduction, we need to find different spaces of commonalities and threats we can work upon and cool off the situation right now. We cannot only press into the old systems and the old thinking of re-establishing the status quo, because everybody knows re-establishing the status quo is not the place we're going to be when all this is over. It will be a completely new landscape. And the essence of it, and then I come to recommendation 2, is: does Russia accept other states' rights to choose their own alliances or not? Recommendation 2 dwelled on actively developing non-Western lines of economic and political cooperation, and here Ivan and his colleagues dwelled on China and India. And we saw this during the Ukrainian crisis, that China made a gas deal that Russia made a gas deal with China, and more or less threatened West Europe to say we can go east, we can be an Asian power as much as we can be a European power. My take on this would be, this is rather a choice of necessity. It is not voluntarily, when you look upon the infrastructural, the cultural and the political and the personal linkages of Russia, the Russian people, the Russian institutions. It is much more an European state than it is an Asian state. This might shift over time. We look into the future, and it will, because how the China-Russian relation will play out in the next 7 years is decisive for Russia's future, more probably on the security side than on the economic side, and this is going to be the big game changer. So my take here is, as long as Russia has no counter-offer to the One Road, One Belt initiative, it says it's going to join that. If it doesn't play a structural role in the new Silk Road initiative, it will not play out economically in that region. It will be a junior partner, and this is why you definitely have to come to grips politically, economically, and socially which role you want to play in Central Asia vis-à-vis China and India, beyond delivering weapons, gas and oil. What is your economic and political model for the region? And Central Asia lacks a whole lot of institutional security, may it be collective, may it be in bilateral agreements. When it comes to the Greater Middle East, non-lines of economic and political cooperation, yes, Russia plays a huge role in sorting out the difficulties in that region. From a Western perspective, we would say this is power politics. If you cool off and say, yes, this area needs some kind of order, it is hugely important when it comes to terrorist insurgents in the southern belly of Russia. But as long as you only provide sweat, toil, blood and tears in that region and come not up with a security order, this will not be for endurance, and as long as it's basically a power game between Tehran, Ankara, Moscow and Tel Aviv, will not survive this intervention, because Russia already now is overstretched economically. Third thing, and I move forward that we have enough time for discussion, securing compromises on key political problems with the West, especially on security. As I just hinted, as long as the Crimean question is not resolved, there will be no real deal with the West. This is for a simple reason. If any actor be allowed to change the equilibrium or the borders of Europe by coercive means, unilaterally, international law is worthless, because international law is there to protect the small states for the big powers strive to change the equilibrium. This is true for any country. And I know that it might be perceived that the European Union is such a kind of entity who's pushing forwards borders into a different direction, even more so NATO. So there are similarities, but there are differences. It is the voluntary agreement of countries who choose their own alliances vis-à-vis the question whether a big country asks for special rights in its neighborhood and has the power to change the equilibrium. So as long as this question is not resolved, there will be no real deal. But the question is how we can make a start for cooperation without giving up our positions, without losing face back home. And it's a reality that both sides have locked themselves into their policies. Russian, or should I say Putin, and the Kremlin locked itself in because it, with the integration of the Crimean into the Russian Federation, it raised the threshold so high that it has no leeway for maneuvering anymore on this question. The political fate of Putin is bound to the Crimean question, and as long as Putin is president of Russia, there will be no change of the Crimean situation. The same is true for the European Union. The European Union has locked itself into the question whether Ukraine can be part of the European Union or not. So it will be the protagonist, and Germany will be the protagonist of Ukraine having the right to enter the European Union. And it's a win-all, lose-all game. It's a zero-sum game. So the question is how to bypass the situation, and my suggestion would be look at the Cold War lessons in Germany's East politic of the 60s and 70s. We're pretty much in the same situation there. Yes, we know we were losing ground, but the question was how to secure order, prosperity and peace in Europe. And the question was here, can we find mutual interests and mutual threats where we can work upon without addressing this situation and without locking ourselves in only this discussion? And the suggestion would be there are plenty of items where we can work on. I already mentioned climate change and its impact on infrastructure and the Arctic region. I mentioned, we should mention food security of the world. Russia has the highest potential for food production and food export worldwide, probably comparable to East Africa, especially when permafrost is changing the geopolitical landscape or geographic landscape. Arms control in the age of automation and artificial intelligence. Here, Russia definitely has an edge. And it would be a proof of the pudding if Russia would make a first step in trying to establish a regime of arms control in the digital sector. And the same is true for the proliferation and privatization of weapons of mass destruction. For that, let me go fast forward because I talked too long already. Recommendation 4, the reinforcement of global government institutions. Russia heavily relies on the UN Security Council because of its privilege to sit there and have a veto. So it is basically the proof that it is a global power with a special status. But we all know that the UN Security Council is in limbo as long as the three big powers play their power games and haven't sought out the differences worldwide. So the UN Security Council will not be the place, and the United Nations will not be the place where common goods are being produced. May it be security, may it be climate change and the habitat, may it be trade and financial issues, and all the humanitarian issues which derive from the failure of global governance. So the question is how to come to grips with the system. We talk about UN reforms since 15, probably 20 years. This will not happen as long as we're in the middle of such a crisis. So the question would be, can we lower the bar and start having regional forms of integrated systems which are attached to the United Nations system? We have a desperate need for security in the Middle East region, a desperate need for security at the Horn of Africa. This is probably not something Russia is too much interested in providing, but here are spaces and room for cooperation which can be the proof of the pudding. Russia should heavily invest and co-opt Western countries in establishing new systems of order in the Greater Middle East. The Astana format will not be enough. The same is true for other parts of Europe when it comes to the insecure situation around Israel, its neighbors, which has changed heavily during the last 10 years. This is something Russia could be part of too. As I said earlier, Russia is probably the only country which has a stake in the big regions, maybe East Europe, maybe the Baltic, the Balkans, and the Caucasus, Central Asia, the Middle East, and the Arctic, not to speak of the North Pacific. So the question is, could it be a good global citizen and can it provide security, prosperity and stability in all those named regions? And it would be all too easy to start at least in a dual-track diplomacy effort. Last recommendation on task 5, linking Russia foreign policy to its domestic development agenda. I think this is a very simple argument to make. As long as Russia will not open up and be a more pluralistic, I do not say democratic, I say pluralistic, transparent and accountable society in the economic sphere and the political sphere, it will never widen its foreign policy toolbox. Because after all, building trust and reliability is not about accumulating hard power, it is making use of soft power also, which means what is the attractiveness of your societal model? Where is your power to create and innovate? And how is your ability to be an enabler and not to be an obstructor? Make use of your cultural identity and richness and build a narrative for a common future in your respective spaces. And this closes, I guess, the cycle, because credible hard power component is indispensable for a world-spreading country like Russia. As Frederick the Great once said, diplomacy without arms is like music without instruments. This is very much true in the modern world. But in the long haul, Russia can only survive as a global power if it develops its soft power capabilities. If not, it will be soon overstretched.
Thank you, Oliver. Just to follow up with, before I pass rule to Natalia, to develop the idiom of Frederick the Great about the music and the instrument. Well, it's possible to sing and to clap hands, and to produce music as an option.
As an option, yeah. A cappella.
Yeah, a cappella.
Thank you, Oliver, for your vision and for your comments. And our second speaker is Ivan Timofeев, REACT Program Director, and he will share his vision of the future environment and especially on Russia-EU relations in this world environment. And I would just to remind you that this discussion is open and we streamed online, and the records also will be available after the meeting. And we have some people who follow us on Facebook and on the REACT website right now. Please, Ivan.
Yeah, Oliver, Natasha, thank you, and thank you, Oliver, for your open-minded presentation. We are not here to be nice guys to each other, and I value your sincere comments, which someone in the Russian audience may not like. And I think it's important to be open and to show our real attitudes beyond this politex and all of this nice guy respect things. So I would also try to address most critical points, most complicated things, both in our relations with the West and in Russian foreign policy and our international agenda. So for me, it's clear, like for many of my colleagues, that one of the fundamental blocks in the development of our relations is, of course, the conflicts around Ukraine, and of course its toxic impact was and is so high that it ruined many achievements we had in our relations, we reached, in 25 years, and it will be affecting these relations in the future, despite the existing common interests, despite rational calculations of, let's say, expenses and outlays of this competition, or to put it sincerely and bluntly, rivalry and mutual containment and deterrence. And the fact that we have this crisis, well, it used to be a crisis 3 years ago, now 4 years ago. Now it is rather a stable disease. When we have a patient in reanimation and he is stable in his bad condition. So this this fact, the fact that we have this, all of this negative stuff, makes us think on two important things, two important points. On why we are at this point, and what should be done to, what are the ways out. And I like a point highlighting that there is a need to find some formula which will allow the sides not to sacrifice their position, principal positions, because Crimea, for instance, Crimea for Russia is a principal position. So Donbass is a matter of negotiations, but it is clear that, let's say, any speculation here about concessions on Crimea would not work due to obvious reasons. So, and this is a inter-party consensus, unlike Donbass. The Crimea thing is much to a higher extent consensus here in the country due to different reasons. So, in a sense, we should be very careful on choosing the possible trajectories in searching for ways out from the situation we are. And I agree that the reputation, face-saving things are also important, because the European Union has its values, Russia has its values, and reputation is a great power, a demand for respect. US has its own set of values, quite specific and sometimes, let's say, poorly understood, both in Russia and sometimes in Europe also. I'm not speaking about the rest of the world. So, two important questions: why we are at this point? What is the Ukrainian crisis? What is the Ukrainian issue? Is it a source of the existing problems, which came abruptly, or is it a result of the previous dynamics which led us to this crisis? And well, I assume that to a high extent, what we had in 2014 was a result of ad hoc decisions in a limited time frame, in a, let's say, in a situation with lack of communication, and at that time also lack of trust between the main powers. But the very existence of the very emergence of this issue is a result of much longer tendency. And what alarms me is that in this blame game, who is guilty, who did what in this Ukrainian issue, we are losing a discussion on what made it possible. Because this discussion undermines the political positions of both sides. In the Russian case, it's quite hard to defend from the point of view of international law and from the point of view of, let's say, of Helsinki principles. It's hard to defend and justify the events of 2014. So in this sense, the West has a very powerful argument that, folks, you subscribed Helsinki Treaty, Helsinki Chart, you are a part of Budapest Memorandum, you are a part of blah 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 blah. So it's very, from politically, it's there is a line of defense, but from the viewpoint of international law and and also common sense, it's much harder. So in this sense, the West has a strong legal and moral leverage to criticize Russia. So we should, I think we should recognize this from our side. At the same time, we should not obscure the mistakes and misactions which were done from the Western side too. And these mistakes, this lesson should be learned. Russian side very often refers to Yugoslavia case, while it is now treated in the West like a sort of a manipulation from the Russian side, but it is not. The issue is there. It was a very important precedent and very, let's say, a situation when one OSCE member was attacked and actually forced for dismemberment by other OSCE members. So that, of course, Western observers would say that there were no territorial annexations to use this term. Again, this term is overloaded in terms of politics now, in political sense. But let's use it for the expert aims, yeah, or Iraqi intervention with this, chemical weapon mystification. Again, it was unilateral aggression, and we can call it aggression or we can call it intervention with no annexations, but still it was a violation of the international law, and it was a unilateral solution. What is we forget that Russia, Germany, and France were on the one line to say to show its their protest for this issue. There are different other things like the erosion of the arms control regimes and the destruction of the Treaty on Conventional Arms, which undermined European security. You mentioned the right thing about the Russian recognition of the right of other independent states to choose their alliances. And again, I agree that it's a part of the Russian NATO Charter of 1997, but there were two other things. OSCE as a universal organization, the key security organization of NATO, and the devotion to arms control regimes, especially to the Treaty on Conventional Arms. And we lost it before Ukrainian fights completely. Again, when I participated in different meetings on the Ukrainian crisis and Russia-West relations, and the alarming tendency is that we are not learning from the past, trying to obscure them, not to undermine our political positions at the current state. And these tendencies are very salient both on the Russian and the Western side. So, in my view, the problem we have now regarding Ukraine should be a lesson, and a lesson which shows the shortcomings of the security system we had after the end of the Cold War. So, of course, there is a temptation by some authors to blame it on vicious Russian political system, that some people in the Russian political elite decided voluntaristically to corrupt the European order, and they did that and that. Now, after Ukraine, they are being blamed in collusions, etc. So all the things are there. But you know, the problem is much deeper. We should approach it taking into account different factors which make this situation possible. And if we really want to have a secure Europe and to find a way out from this, there should be a sort of a joint understanding of what made it possible. And I think there are two good signs for this. The first one is our experience on the discussion of Georgian crisis. You mentioned this, and there was a very balanced report of OSCE after the crisis in Georgia, prepared by Heidi. And well, there was an understanding of what made it possible, and there was, I would say, a joint action to let's say, at least to soften the consequences. So my feeling is that we should think about bigger solutions. It's good that we have Normandy format, which failed together in Munich. It's better than nothing. It's good that we have Surkov Volker format, though it is fruitless. And I think they will be quite empty and useless until we don't have a big idea behind these, let's say, interactions. So I may sound naive, but I think that such an idea could be the one of a greater Europe, of a common security space. And this idea has been devaluated. It was devaluated to a large extent. So now it is considered to be idealistic. It is attributed to Mikhail Gorbachev, whose reputation now is very low, or to, let's say, other good old times. But you know, I think such an idea may be realistic in the long run if you think about the future. And by the way, it will test the maturity of EU diplomacy, the maturity of EU as a pole, as an important actor, global actor. Now there are lots of discussions whether EU is a let's say is a power. Well, I think a power is recognized when it does something constructive. If it has a project in mind, not just military, not just guns and butter, not just lots of guns, not lots of butter, but some ideas, some concepts. And what we have now is an absence of these concepts. So there is still an idea of European integration and mechanical enlargement, but this is the idea of the late 20th century. It may be reproduced in the speeches of of high-level officials from the EU, but let's say it's a good idea, but it's already done. It's already realized. So it is not charismatic now. It is not perceived by the youth as something sexy. It is a piece of cake. But what could be the idea? The idea could be the resolution of the existing crisis, of the existing the idea of making existing powder barrels wheat. And let's say some joint project for greater Europe could be a solution. It could have a specific aim to decrease and to eliminate power competition in the region, to address the crisis and the problem we have, and to start it not from the details, not from to move, let's say, in a holistic way, not in individualistic way. So now the overall approach is we will not start any conversations with you until Ukrainian issue or Crimean issue or Donbass issue is done. This is an individualistic approach. We are starting from details. I have in my numerous conversations with European diplomats, with EU scholars, my question was the following, and I repeat it from time to time. What do you want from Russia first? Do you want to eliminate the possibility of future crisis with us? Or do you want to punish us? These are different tasks. For instance, when we discuss peacekeeping, possible peacekeeping mission in Donbass, I ask, what do you want? Do you want punishment? Or do you want elimination of the crisis? Do you want a ceasefire? Do you want the reduction of victims? The reduction of the intensity of conflict? And in many cases, my European colleagues are confused. The temptation to punish is too strong. And well, it can be understood. We have similar temptations here, just to show that you know, we have our own voice, and well, I don't like the means how it is done, but you know, the very demand for the reaction should be taken into account. So I think that this approach from the Ukrainian issue, to start from Ukrainian issue, is legitimate, and it is rational, it can be understood, but it will not work. It will not work, at least in the nearest future. And I think it is not touched. You mentioned Vladimir Putin, and you mentioned Kremlin. I think it is not just touched to the existing political system, to the existing political leaders, to the existing political cycle. It will be with us beyond the future political cycle. And it will. I think it's naive to link it to just to leaders and leader solutions, because it is much higher than just the decisions of leaders. So in this way, if you want to be strategic, and if you want to go beyond punishment and crime and punishment, or crimes and punishments, we should think and approach the situation holistically. So start from the discussion of, let's say, the system we would like to have, the modality of the system, the resources we can propose each other. My Western colleagues often ask me about what can Russia propose us. They think nothing. I say think twice. or better more. In many respects, this is a factor of our compatibility in the future, of our let's say ability to compete in the globalizing world. Many intellectuals now write about the disintegration of the world. Many welcome multipolarity, and multipolarity is an attractive thing in terms of, let's say, so-called global democracy, when we have different poles with their own words, with their own, let's say, rights, etc. But there is a price for multipolarity. The responsibility of not making it a chaos, of not making it chaotic, because it may turn to chaos easily. So calling for a multipolar world, we should be aware of these higher anarchic and chaotic tendencies. And in this, let's say, when our colleagues welcome deglobalization, and when they welcome the disruption of liberal world order, and here I would advertise a recent paper created by Center for Strategic Research on the future of the liberal world order. So when we are happy about the collapse of the liberal world order, do we think about our own competitiveness in the new world order? For instance, would Russia be more competitive and secure in the collapsing world order, in the conditions of high anarchy, when we have disorder in the West, when we have containment in the West, when we have disorder in the South, and when we have growing power competition in the East, and maybe in the North? So is it good for us? Will it make us more secure? Should we be happy about this? We may be happy on this, let's say, in our, let's say, old negative attitude to American leadership in the world. So if their happiness on the collapse of the liberal world order as a sort of a revenge to the US domination. But will it make us more secure? Will it make Europe more secure? So I think that this idea on, let's say, greater Europe, we may call it in a different way, more, let's say, more, we should think about marketing of it to make it more attractive. But I think the issue of security, both for European Union and for Russia, in this, let's say, growing chaos of international order, is something we should think about. So holistic approach versus individualistic one. I know it's hard, and I know it's there is a strong, let's say, mistrust to this concept in the EU and in the West in general. It is perceived as an attempt of Russia to obscure and to diminish pressure on Ukraine, as some sort of a distraction of the Western attention from the so-called real problems. But well, I don't see any other alternative. And it is this moment, this historic moment of history, is critical to European Union, even not to Russia, but for the EU. It's a sort of bifurcation. EU diplomacy is growing up. EU is growing as an independent actor. We may speculate on the role of the US, and still it is very high, and NATO is important for Europe. But the future of independent European diplomacy depends on its ability to create favorable conditions in Greater Europe, and even in Greater Europe. And EU has resources and let's say capabilities to promote it. It requires political will. It requires statement, as Chancellor Gnad used to put it. So, a statement who would go beyond the populism and routine bureaucracy, and propose out of the box ideas, and would lead others to do this. So there is a lack of such leaders in Europe now, in the European Union. But I think that this path is inevitable. The alternative is growing chaotization, is let's say freezing of the situation we have. Will we survive under these conditions? I think we will. Europe will survive, I mean European Union. Russia will too, even under sanctions. We will suffer in terms of quality of life, we will suffer in terms of development, we will lose many opportunities, but you can, well, it doesn't mean that this is fatal for us. But there is an alternative thing which may be more, let's say, attractive and more beneficial. So this is a brief reaction. Quite controversial, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Ivan. And Anton, would you like to comment?
Sure, I kind of feel that I have to, since especially considering how eloquent was, we're both, Ivan and Oliver, in promoting some of the work that we've done. Actually, I have to say that most of the glory for carrying the intellectual burden of working on both the thesis for foreign policy and for the report on the international liberal world order that Ivan mentioned all the glory belongs to REAC. We just asked the questions and made the joyful yellow and gold covers, which was a quite demanding job in its own, but still. And from this point, I will render myself completely irresponsible by stating that I do not represent necessarily CSR's view on any of the things discussed, but as somebody engaged into discussions themselves and as a foreign policy analyst myself. Maybe I'll focus and comment on some of the things that both Oliver and Ivan said about the environment we're in, because I think that is perhaps the most important part. And of course, the work that we've been doing for the last couple of years was more focused on how to make Russia more competitive and more successful in the world that you've been describing, and it's very difficult to actually figure out how exactly do you do that. That is why we've spent so much effort on that. I think that among the challenges that were mentioned, perhaps I could add some to those. Definitely technological change is the most important that we feel will define how the world operates, and of course various types of disruption that follow technological change and automation, the changing nature of work, the changing distribution of jobs, how they appear, where they appear, do they appear, and especially if we take tendencies fueled by automation like reshoring and the return of production facilities back to the developing world. I think that one of the most popular cited examples is the Nike plant that was returned to Germany, and which didn't create many jobs exactly because it is almost completely automated, but it was widely perceived as stealing hundreds probably jobs from a developing country, right? And a lot of countries will now be deprived of the opportunity to follow the East Asian model of development, selling cheap labor and accumulating money within the country by those avenues. And of course, we are facing the changing nature of work will also mean threat of loss of purpose for a lot of people. And what do we do with the people who have lost their purpose? Especially if we start discussions about the guaranteed income, basic income, right? How do we compensate for the loss of purpose? And the society's number one organizing principle. Work has been helping us structure all of our lives for the last 100 years at least, and now if we lose that, what do we do with our lives? I think that is an issue that is also very well reflected in how countries seek their place in the world, because as a lot of global public goods are increasingly provided by private actors, not by state actors as it was in some years ago, and in the last decade we're used to that. And now states face this risk of, at least there's a feeling that they lose control over what is happening in the world. Not necessarily they do. They try to gain some ground back by developing state capacities for cyber operations, for example, and cyber defenses. They try to regulate what is happening in the space, in the seas, in the business environment, regulation, but businesses are more and more influential in those avenues. And I think that global businesses have been the driving force of globalization, and I think that, we'll still see there is definitely a demand, if not for more globalization, then at least for better globalization. So I think that those tendencies will continue. I think what is also hurting and challenging states all over the world, and this is something well known to large actors like European Union, like Russia and the United States, is not just the lack of trust between countries, but also a deep lack of trust within countries. That is something that we in Russia face greatly, and which hurts our ability to change and reform. And for Russia, one of the key challenges is that, for example, if you look at the United States, in Russia and the United States, the level of trust in government is pretty much at the same level. But if we take trust to strangers, in the United States, it's about at the same level as trust to government, but in Russia, it's much lower. So we have a serious issue of a disintegrating social fabric in the country, which creates what we call mistrust taxes, right? A lot of transactions have to be safeguarded and not based on trust as they should be. So all of those things are also challenging both Russia and Europe. I think that this is the #1 challenge, and if we're thinking about the future, I'm really glad that we've started this discussion about the future. I think it is one of the things that our center can be proud of. We have been advocating for more talk about the future, and REAC has been very supportive in this in this sense. For the decades to come, every country will have to find its own niche, and that is something that's becoming very difficult. As niches change, new niches appear, old niches cease to exist, and I think it would be a great mistake for governments to be focused on some issues that may not turn out to be important at all in 50 years, for example. That is, and I think history has a lot of examples like that. A lot of disruptive events. I mean, I don't think the disruption is anything new. The Suez Canal was something that was absolutely disruptive. Maybe not less than artificial intelligence. So the big question here is how do we adapt, and how do we align our adaptation strategies in the next decades? Because I mean, maybe we cannot worry about aligning our adaptation strategies with countries that are further away, but it is necessary to know where your partners in the nearest neighborhood are going. Because if there is no clear trajectory, or at least a supposed trajectory for your partner's future development, then it is very difficult to plan your own. Maybe I will end my very hectic and chaotic statement by picking up on something that Ivan said about punishment and result. Right? I think that one of the very good examples, and it's something that we've been, some of my colleagues at CSR have been looking at, is when we try to regulate punishment for drug-related crimes. You have to really discern between different functions of justice, where the function of justice is to create retribution, punishment that is, when it has to serve resocialization, and when does it have to serve deterrence of future crime. And those are three very different tasks. And when you give a 4-year prison sentence to somebody who has been caught in the street with a personal use dose of marijuana, you do deter him from committing that crime in the next 4 years. You do punish him, but the end result is that you criminalize somebody who may not have been criminalized. I'm not drawing direct analogies between what is happening in our relation with the West and with the European Union, but I'm saying that that punishing, that resocializing, and deterring are three completely different tasks which you cannot do by the same instruments. So we're discussing analogies just a couple of days ago with Ivan and people here at the Russian Council. They are limited in their efficiency, but they can be very insightful. So thank you for this. I hope that Oliver will answer some of the questions, which I'm sure there are a lot of them. Thank you.
Thank you. And since we have only 12 minutes left, I open the floor for discussion. Natalia, please. A button.
Как кнопку нажать?
Не работает справа. Другое.
Natalia Sukan, High School of Economics. Dear colleagues, thanks for your statements. Oliver, thanks for yours. And I have a short question on our Russian-EU relations from the German point of view, and taking into consideration the current government crisis in Germany. So, what do you think about the future of the German leadership, well, informal leadership, or let's say political weight in Europe? What do you think about the first part, the European chapter of the currently published coalition treaty, along with the fact that the next finance minister is going to be a social democrat, and what do you think about the possibility of the softening and easing of the sanctions on Russia, which another social democrat, the current foreign minister, or maybe the future foreign ministry, Zygmunt Gabriel, mentioned a couple of days ago. And I've got an idea of a book for Ivan. I'm not quite sure it's brand new, but definitely a bestseller, Crimea and Punishment. Thank you.
We could gather several questions and then give the floor to the speakers. You had a question as well?
Yeah, I had.
Could you please turn on the mic?
My name is Oливер, I'm a chemo student, 3-year-old, 3-year student, 3-year student. So I can't agree more with Ivan that the Ukrainian crisis is a test, for the UN, that's for the EU, for the EU policy. But there is another test, and it concerns the Middle East issues. You know, there are many talks about Ireland, Saudi Arabia, about Syria, Yemen, so on and so forth. But there is another issue that we started to forget. It's the issue of the Palestinians and the Palestinian leaders. Mahmoud Abbas last week visited Moscow, but Mahmoud Abbas is going to leave the office, and there is another generation of Palestinian leaders who didn't participate in Oslo negotiation process, who haven't negotiated with Israel at all, and who will need some power, some authority to act. And some experts say that sooner or later this conflict will emerge again, and we'll see the new war in Palestine. And the EU is an actor in so-called Middle East Quartet, where Russia, the USA, and the UN act. But in this quartet, just Russia and the US make some actions. So, what's the European vision on this issue, and is Europe ready for this upcoming challenge? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Alexey Khmylov, RTH company. Just two more precise questions. When you mentioned that you do not see any solution or solving the problem in the relation between Russia and Europe without solving the Crimea question, you mean giving it back to Ukraine or some other solution? And if it's your personal opinion or the Foreign Office position. And one more question, you mentioned about the sort of alternative of United Nations Security Council, regional one. You mean it's for the possible overcoming the veto of some member, or what are the reasons? Thanks.
I will take the last question. The first person.
Thank you very much. Mikhail Frolov, GIMO. I have basically two questions. The first one, well, the relations between the European Union and Russia have been steadily deteriorating in the last years. As we all know, that at many issues we have reached like a deadlock. We don't have a new agreement, institutional framework agreement. We still base our cooperation on the agreement from the previous century, at least from the late 90s. So we don't have common European economic space. We don't have common security space, which was offered by the former Russian President Medvedev in 2008, which would probably allow to incorporate Russia into this institutional framework, and would have probably prevented the escalation of some crises. So my question is whether it was not a missed opportunity which would exactly allow incorporating Russia in this institutional common European framework. And the second question, well, of course you mentioned that there are different threats and interests, common threats and interests which the European Union and Russia have. But actually you are completely right by saying that putting out some questions out of brackets is exactly a good tactic if you want to reach an agreement in those fields we can cooperate in. But can we be exactly friends in those fields like terrorism or climate change, which can be considered to be global issues, when we consider ourselves to be, let's say, adversaries in bilateral relations? Because in my perspective, good bilateral relations are can be considered as let's say a precondition for good cooperation on the global level, and having in mind that we are not exactly friends, how can we cooperate globally? Thank you.
Thank you. We have about 5 to 7 minutes left. It's challenging for our speakers, but please, Oliver, yes.
Thanks for your questions. Every one of those deserve a thorough answer, and it is quite challenging, is it? Let me go from the end to the first question, Victor. Right? The question is, how can we cooperate if we are not exactly friends in bilateral relations? And this is what I said, hinting at our experience during the Cold War. We threatened ourselves with mutual destruction, but we came up with the Helsinki Final Accord, because at the end of the day, the final analysis matters, not the way you look at things at the moment. If your final analysis is what Ivan hinted at, and Anton too, is that you have a security risk in your periphery and you accept that as a common threat. Don't concentrate on the frictions and the difficulties you have. Find a way to address those threats. You were hinting at terrorism. Who defines who's a terrorist? This is the question we are having for decades in the UN Commission on Human Rights and other things. So this is probably the more difficult question, but it's not all too difficult to identify those pockets of insecurity within societies, maybe in the Islamic world, maybe in our populism and our societies which invest in the divide of society, as Anton hinted at. It's very easy to identify those non-aligned, non-compliant actors within your societies which project their idea of insecurity to the world. Even you don't have to name them anti-systemic, anti-terrorist, or whatever. You just identify the risk and then work on it. You can work on money laundering. You can work on visa regimes and how to control free traffic of people. You can work on positive side, on educating people on the policy front. You can invest into your own marketing as a free, open, but enabling society for everyone. It is a long game, a ball game, so this is something you can do. The other thing is dual track diplomacy. We did that in all of the crises. If you do not want to lose face for obvious reasons in your home constituency, make use of those people and networks who still work with each other, who have a constant, strong relationship. Science, civil society, very, very difficult right now between Russia and Europe. You know the reasons. Also, it is the very soft topics. Cultural exchange, tourism. It sounds funny and negligible, but this is the way how you recreate bonds and common understanding. This is nothing for the short haul. It is something for the long haul. So this would be my answer to how to reopen negotiation space. When it comes to common space, you hinted at Medvedev's Lisbon to Vladivostok speech and Putin's approach in the early 2000s. I remember him speaking in German to the German Bundestag in 2005. Everybody was deeply impressed. And this was no game show, this was no propaganda. This is something he really meant during that time, because the situation was a completely different situation during that time, 15 years ago. I would suggest to have a look at what Ivan proposed when he took part in the Berlin exercise. And I just want to hint at, he came up with the idea, and it is one of the main articles in that newspaper. Think about a honeycomb order. A honeycomb order is not a bipolar order. It is an order which has an overlap between polycentric regions and multipolarity. If you accept that you live in a world of a multipolarity, then you accept that you have different centers of power, yes, with surrounding minor incorporating space. Yes, it is a world where regional hegemons play the big ball games, and the smaller countries are smaller countries. It is a different ball game than the 20th century EU world. If we like it or not, I think we have to face that fact, especially we Europeans. May I just come quickly to your question, very precise question on no solution for the Crimean question, no cooperation? No, this is not the case. It is, yes, and this is an answer to Ivan's point too. There is a normative point where Europeans, and especially Germans, as a small power in comparison to Russia and the United States, cannot make any leeway. It is, as long as the Crimean question is not being sorted out, at least between Ukraine and Russia, at least, not to speak of the international level, we cannot let Russia get away with this annexation. It needs to be addressed somehow. It needs to be sorted out, maybe through a moratorium, which is difficult because now it's part of the Russian Federation, be some kind of OECD, rather UN Security Council mandate, which means Russia needs to sit at the table and concede at the UN Security Council, yes, we're taking a step back, and we have some kind of caretaking of the United Nations of this issue, maybe as mediator between Ukraine and Russia, maybe as a force which from the Donbass first try to separate the parties and then work on further on those issues.
No, but I don't speak about Donbass or just Crimea. Do you believe it might be anything but not Russian? You personally?
Don't want to comment on that too deeply, but you know the discussion in Germany. We're divided in our society too. Those who understand Putin as it is put in the media, and those who have a seemingly more differentiated view. The thing is, everybody hints at the situation when Khrushchev handed over the Crimean to Ukraine as something probably unconstitutional according to the Soviet constitution. This is not a legalized issue. It is a question of how you perceive common spaces, which historically belonged to either way, was independent. It's not something you can sort out on the table with an act of law. It is something the societies have to iron out themselves. because there is historical, cultural overlay and interest overlay. So it's a very weak answer, I know, but this is nothing a German has to decide. It's just a perspective. If you can sort it out peacefully, you end up in an enduring crisis which will never lead to a more positive outcome. As for well, we can discuss it later over a cup of coffee.
Okay.
As for sorry, it takes me a bit. As for the MENA region, different kind of leadership. As you all know, Fatah and Hamas somehow found an agreement. Is going to look how long this lasts. As you all know, the government of Israel, Mossad, and the Fatah in Ramallah working closely together since years because they know they have to iron out this conflict. How far this goes in the current situation, I won't predict. My take is this will not be a very strong basis for cooperation between Israel and the Palestinians because it is now so dynamic in that region given the intrusion of Iran in Syria and the threat it poses to Israel and the threat we've seen Netanyahu poses to Iran. It's so dynamic. The rule of the game is going to be completely different if this is going to be going to last. So what role of EU? You see it in the last 3 years on the combat on ISIS. No troops on the ground. Germany will never send troops on the ground, boots on the ground to the Far East. One exception. And this is what Angela Merkel said almost 10 years ago in the Knesset. If the right of existence of Israel is in threat, Germany is going to be involved some kind if Israel demands it militarily. What that means exactly, we do not know, but this is the plea she gave in the Knesset 10 years ago. And everybody knows that because the raison d'etre of the German state is the existence of Israel. You can't untie that. Well, one more thing, and then sorry for that long answer. Germans wait in the EU after the Grand Coalition and the EU chapter. As you all know, as I just said, I expect the Grand Coalition to be in place in 2 weeks' time. It's a very strong chapter on the role of EU integration within that chapter. This is not only pushed into by the Social Democrats, but it is a consensus between both parties, even all 3 parties, the CSU included, which was the most difficult part, because we all know that we are thriving into a 2-speed Europe, and this is my take. If Europe is not going to modernize in the way that it has an inner core, which basically is the Eurozone, which will go deeper then on financial market integration, social union, and then the more political and defense union is already on the table. And if we can't sort out the differences, especially with the Visegrad countries, we have to find a formula, and the formula is 2-speed Europe, which opens up new possibilities for cooperation in Central Europe, according to what you said. If we have a soft belly here, you have to harden it, and this would be an opportunity and a litmus test whether Russia is willing and able to cooperate here. German weight in EU diminishing, I guess, because of a lack of leadership. If Angela Merkel is really going in the full 4-year term, she is lame duck already back home. Remains to be seen whether she's going to be strengthened during the course of her government. But this is not that important because it's important that you have a huge consensus about Franco-German leadership in the European Union, and I think this is a given. Nevertheless, we have a strong right-wing party now in parliament.
Thanks. And do you believe Merkel is going to leave in 2 years?
I don't know. I would say she better does the transition. But as you have seen in German politics, when Adenauer left, he said he's going to leave in 2 years' time. He will be dead the day she pronounces that. So she can't say that. As you saw yesterday, she has a new Secretary General. This is definitely an effort by her to introduce a convincing scheme. But you know, the first names to be named will never be, at the end of the day, taking that job. I'm skeptical about the dynamics within the party system.
Ivan, could you please comment on some of the questions and sum up the meeting?
Well, okay. So my summing up will be very simple. I would like to thank Oliver for coming and for his insights to our work, for feedback to the text we did with the Center for Strategic Research. We exchanged ideas before this meeting, and I think it would be useful for both of our organizations to make similar discussions in Germany and to get more feedbacks to our work. And I personally, as one of the co-authors of this piece, I would be happy if we have a development of it and we have, let's say, bigger feedbacks from our colleagues in Germany. Thank you. And thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you.